always awkward, right? Like when we know the countdown's done, it's like, now we're live. Not really. Welcome back to WCHS, you guys. And today we're going to review lessons 5 to 10 because we have a midterm coming up on Wednesday. So in lesson 5, when you review lesson 5, what should you pay particular attention to? Spoiler alert, the things in red. The things in red mean, hey, pay attention over here. So we want you to understand this quote. If you don't see this quote on Wednesday, you should see it on the second version of the multiple choice, or maybe you should see this quote on an A1. The quote is trying to wrestle between, when should we control the economy because there's a conflict between public and private interest. So we want you to be able to look into the economic system and see how sometimes selfishness can get in the way of the common good. So this is just a general speech. One way to study when you go through the online resource is when you see speeches like this boxed in red, go through them and see if you can find an ideological perspective. See if you can see a problem that's being exposed, a solution that's either explicit or implicitly there. Can we infer some values, some assumptions, maybe some miscalculations or bias? Is there a context to it that is either stated or implied? So those are ways to go back over it. But just in general, one thing to look for the test is when the private and public interests collide. The first main concept that we get here is the concept of scarcity. So we need to know that we have a nearly infinite amount of needs and wants, but we have a finite amount of resources, and therefore we have scarcity. And how countries respond to scarcity should match up with our values and beliefs. And our responses to scarcity would be our 3 basic economic questions. So, should see the term scarcity, should understand what it means. Just have some visuals to explain what scarcity looks like. We have that facing scarcity when governments try to allocate their scarce resources. If they allocate it towards consumer items, we call that emphasizing butter. If they put it towards government and military objectives, we call that guns. So we have the guns versus butter conflict. And although the airplane in here has U.S. symbols on the wing, it'd be the Soviet Union that historically would be an example of a country that lost the hearts and minds of the people by overemphasizing guns at the expense of butter. There's a nice visual talking about scarcity and how it leads to those 3 basic economic questions. So that's the beginning of this. Now, how do we answer the 3 basic economic questions? In a command economy, such as Stalin's USSR, he created a government bureaucracy called Gosplan that answered those questions. And he decided that what they needed to do was rapidly industrialize so that he could catch up to the Western powers. And therefore, in a Machiavellian way, he sacrificed 6 million kulaks to fund that industrialization, to pay for it. Another thing that we have in lesson 5 is this extensive idea of how did the Industrial Revolution unlock a different life. So what was good about the Industrial Revolution, what was bad about it? Although it is boxed up in red, this information is more so for an A2, for an essay. It'd be tough for me to create a good multiple choice question that doesn't have the answer just right there embedded in the question. So please keep that in mind. You don't have a need to memorize all of this for the multiple choice, although the term factory acts could come up and the individual Robert Owen could come up. Factory acts would be an example of an early government intervention. They look at a flaw within classic liberalism and decide there's a response that we need to do. Chartists would celebrate that because Chartists believe that the government could reform liberalism. No need to replace it. We could reform it. Owen, in his new Lanark, where there was no government, he decided to become that government and respond to the exploitation of his workers by paying them more, giving them housing, giving them leisure time and things like that. Again, all of this stuff is more to describe how the Industrial Revolution changed society, more for a essay. So don't memorize all of this for the multiple choice. But yeah, terms like Chartism will definitely be in there. Again, even though this is in red, you don't need to memorize all these acts. The factory acts will be described as a group of government interventions in England in response to the exploitation of children at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We can see some of these cartoons to also further expose some of the flaws of the Industrial Revolution. This cartoon shows the need for unions, as does that. This cartoon actually takes the opposite perspective, that unions do not help the non-working union man, or the non-union working man. And this one takes the opposite perspective again, saying that unions will help us, that on our own we will not get to better working conditions. Because these cartoons are in red, I would expect to see them on one of the versions of the multiple choice. You need to unpack it and say, what is the perspective? Is it celebrating individualism, or is it challenging individualism? And maybe which principles from pages 71 to 85 of the textbook are they specifically celebrating or challenging? And that is lesson 5. This part of lesson 5 is a great summary of the impact of liberalism, but I think this fits in with an essay. How do we describe the transformative nature of the Industrial Revolution and early classic liberalism economically? I think this helps you with your essay. There's too much information there for me to put it into a multiple choice test. So that's lesson 5. Lesson 6 jumps more into chapter 4 of the textbook, which looks at responses to the Industrial Revolution. So you should expect to see Adam Smith for sure. We need to understand that he is the main individual economist connected to laissez-faire classic economic liberalism. And many of these other economists or philosophers are responding to his system. In terms of these responses to classic economic liberalism from chapter 4, we need to understand the Luddites. They're reactionary. They broke into the factories, used weapons to chop up the machines because they believed that the machines represented a threat to artisan skilled workers. And therefore, in a reactionary way, they wanted to destroy the machines and recreate the glory of the cottage system that had previously existed. Chartists believed that they could use democracy to respond to the flaws of classic economic liberalism only if the right to vote was extended to the workers. And as previously mentioned, Owen became the solution to the problem that his employees were facing by abolishing employment of children in his factories, providing them education and health care and leisure, affordable housing, affordable consumable items. Karl Marx is a bigger emphasis, and I did highlight these. You wouldn't need to memorize them. They would be on the test for you, but we need to be able to understand the ills that he saw within capitalism and, just as importantly, his solution. And the main ills: class conflict, his solution, an epiphany that leads to a civil war. Violence is the solution. And his goal is egalitarianism. In the end, everyone will be equal as we work from those according to their ability to those according to their need. Then we jump into the Gilded Age and the idea that this time definitely worked for some. The robber barons who became wealthy by robbing the labor value, but at the same time their wealth wasn't shared by everyone. So this illustration could be on the multiple choice. It says a court for King Cholera. I don't know if you know King Cholera. Cholera is a pandemic. So what they're suggesting is that urbanization, by putting all the workers in these slums, allowed for an explosion of health concerns. So this shows that as a consequence, maybe unintended consequence, of classic economic liberalism, there would be, for some of the workers, a lower quality of life, lower standard of living, and a rise of deadly diseases like cholera. Henry George is in bold. Now, in terms of George, we studied this billboard that was in Manhattan, and I could see that billboard being a part of an exam as well. The billboard is criticizing private property, suggesting we need public property because private property only accumulates in wealth because of the combined investment of the rest of the community. So this private property has sat there and has nearly doubled in value because the community around it has invested in Manhattan. So Henry George is suggesting that the remedy for this would be that the land should be held in common, much like Rousseau said too, as his solution for the malaise of modernity. We talked about the progressives looking at reforming classic liberalism. Specifically, we looked at muckrakers, including Upton Sinclair and his exposure of the jungle with the meat packing plants. With the muckrakers, we also saw other problems exposed, like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Just some quick notes here about the progressive era, that one of the things that Adam Smith did have a problem with in the marketplace was monopolies. If Adam Smith wants a free market, then no one corporation or individual can become so powerful that they take the freedom from the marketplace. So if Standard Oil controls 95% of the oil in the world, then Standard Oil can take the freedom from the marketplace and begin to artificially set high prices because there's a lack of competition. So one of the very few roles the government has in Adam Smith's ideal economy to ensure there's no monopolies. So we'll see the idea of busting up monopolies in the textbook in chapter 4 and chapter 6, and it's also mentioned here as well. One of the specific examples of busting up these monopolies is the Sherman Antitrust Act. And many of these progressive changes are attached to Teddy Theodore Roosevelt. Another progressive change of his was responding to a strike in America. He decided that the government actually had a responsibility not just to the corporations but to the workers themselves, and suggested that the corporations and the workers needed to have a square deal built on honesty and both sides making profits. At this time, we do see some industrial paternalism. We studied Henry Ford and suggested that he paid his workers more than he needed. He helped make the American middle class by paying them $5 a day because he understood that they're also his workers. Industrial paternalism connects into this idea of, do we have welfare capitalism or do we have a welfare state? Welfare capitalism is this concept that, within capitalism, there's entities or individuals like Henry Ford that can take care of the welfare of the workers. Welfare state would be saying, no, it's the government that needs to do it. We have a little bit of notes there on welfare state. If you don't remember much about it, I'd say go back, watch that 4-minute video. And that, my friends, was lesson 6. From lesson 6, we jumped into lesson 7, the Great Depression. With regards to the Great Depression, we need to understand the causes of it, including the beginning, the roaring 20s, unregulated capitalism, why it was working, the demand that was fueling the economy, but also the warning signs that it was not the demand was a bubble that would burst. Stocks were overvalued, there's an oversupply of production, and we had people speculating on the market, buying on the margin. Ultimately, people lost faith in the economy, and that's what caused the crash of 1929. By studying the crash, we could study the boom-bust cycle and Keynes's fiscal monetary solution or response to the boom-bust cycle. We also talked that this wasn't the only time in history that our irrational nature led to a crash in the economy. And we looked at speculation with the tulips in the 17th century, and we looked at speculation with altcoin in the 21st century. This delusional optimism, it seems to be a recurring theme. Leads to a banking crisis, leads to a crisis on the farm, and because of economic protectionism, the U.S. puts up tariffs they actually caused the Great Depression to spread throughout the world because many countries relied upon exporting their goods to America. So when America stopped buying goods from them, they also faced economic recession. We have the responses to the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover decided that, let's let the market correct itself. And unfortunately for him, the market does a very poor job of correcting itself. So in the 1932 election, FDR will be elected with a promise of a New Deal. And the New Deal is basically the idea of freedom through government. Instead of classic liberalism, let's have modern economic liberalism. And you can see that, what is he responding to? He's responding to an explosion of bank failures. He's responding to drought in the prairies. And his New Deal will include different fiscal and monetary solutions. Fiscally, his tax and spend. The spending part, he'll introduce a number of new alphabet agencies designed to help regulate the economy. Specifically, we have the Civilian Conservation Corps that created employment. We have the Tennessee Valley Authority that tried to rebuild that area of America that was hardest hit. We have the Public Works Administration creating some massive projects, infrastructure that may help with the recovered economy once they recover. He wasn't above criticism, though, in the sense that, he had critics on both sides. The left were saying he wasn't doing enough, that the unemployment rate would not go down. On the right, they were saying this is socialism, this is too much, or even that he was behaving unconstitutionally. He was assuming too much power to create laws. So there's a review of the alphabet agencies if you wish to go a little bit deeper into that. A little bit about John Maynard Keynes and his mixed economy, mix of individualism and collectivism, capitalism and socialism. Should expect to see terms like fiscal and monetary policy. And with fiscal and monetary policy, there could be words like fiscal responsibility or fiscal conservatism, deficit or surplus budgeting. Got lots of nice cartoons here. Can't put them all on the test, but here's a cartoon that's questioning the FDR's decision to cut down the old tree and build a new one. This one is suggesting the FDR is acting in the interest of the American people, but maybe the Supreme Court is a little slow getting in his way. And then we had the story from Canada. And in Canada, Prime Minister Bennett was like Hoover, wanted to see capitalism solve the problems itself. The people in Canada become desperate. We have the On to Ottawa trek. We have the Regina riot. Eventually, we have the Mackenzie King government act like FDR and provide freedom through by creating alphabet agencies here in Canada. But we also have the growth of a new political party on the left, the CCF, that becomes the NDP. And that could also appear on the test. This idea that we have not enough government relief through Bennett, and because of that, we have the rise of a new political party, the CCF. And these are all the problems that they were seeing within society that no one was paying attention to. There's R.B. Bennett just watching. And then at the end, we just have some more visuals looking at other bubbles in history. There's that cartoon that we looked at in class as well. Questioning FDR's policies, showing that there's lots of leaks happening, maybe a lot of wasted money in government. From there, we went to the Canadian economy, and we looked at, what elements of the economy warrant government intervention. We looked at this cartoon to see that there's a trade between taxes and public service. So we can assume that this is a mixed economy like Canada. The government saying, this is what we do with your tax dollars. For the sake of your essay, I have these prezzies that can take you into more specific case studies. But these case studies on these prezzies are not for the multiple choice, they're for the essays. COVID-19, pipelines, these case studies are also more for essay writing than they would be for multiple choice. Product safety, healthcare. You could see healthcare pop into the multiple choice because it is a major case study. I find this chart a little much to read for multiple choice. as to is this, but I think that this is a simple ideological perspective to unpack. So you could see this, the idea that in America, the lust of profit ahead of the needs of the consumer or the patient are getting in the way of the medical team responding to the patient. This is another cartoon. This one's critical of socialized medicine, saying that everybody's getting very little service. This is a nice chart that I think is a little easier to read, so that could appear on a test instead, showing that in the United States, the government actually does fund healthcare. And then privately, if you combine private and public funding for healthcare, the United States is spending much more on healthcare than these other countries, and many of them have healthcare systems that are often recognized as quite superior to the American model. So this, along with this, are both presenting that ideological perspective that capitalism is getting in the way of healthy living in America. We have this quote about Sweden. We spent a little bit of time looking at This Is Sweden. The idea that Sweden became a socialist country only after it had a capitalist base. It had already created wealth. But after a couple of decades of socialism, they had to move back towards capitalism because they had created a culture of dependence, not unlike what we see in America following modern economic liberalism. That Keynes is being exposed here, that culture dependency is being exposed here. Hayek and Friedman would agree with is being said here. And that's, for the most part, the end of lesson 8. Lesson number 9 looked at more challenges with Keynes and ultimately the shift away from modern economic liberalism towards neoclassical liberalism. In America, they call themselves neocons because they don't like the word liberal. So this is where we have Reagan and Thatcher and Hayek and Friedman and Rand. So why do we have issues? Well, the main issue that ended up exposing it was stagflation. And unfortunately, we're going to be hearing the term stagflation in our near future as we're seeing the worst inflation that we've seen since 1980 here in Canada and around the world. So we do need to know about Reaganomics and Thatcherism and connecting the two of them to this return back to the economic right, return back to individualism. We could frame their questions around their attacks on unions. We'll definitely see the terms or the names Hayek and Friedman on the test as well connected to them. And some of their core beliefs are outlined here. Might see the term trickle-down economics as they try to argue that the benefits would trickle down to individuals when we give tax cuts to the rich. Connecting it to Mulroney in Canada. Certainly said this a lot, you know, the road to serfdom. That shouldn't be a surprise if it's on the test. The term disparity shouldn't be a surprise if it's on the test or shown in such a way like this. We just added this cartoon the other day to this lesson. I really like that it's exposing Reagan as a hypocrite for feeding one end of the table at the expense of the other. This is a great quote that if it doesn't fit onto a multiple choice test, hopefully it can fit into your essay at some point, as are the observations by Hayek and Rand. Here we have some of the responses to Reagan's economics. These individuals were on strike, and you may remember that Reagan said that they had negotiated in poor faith, and this video shows how Reagan says they should be fired. He also attacked the concept of the welfare queen, this hypothetical woman that was receiving multiple checks, driving a fancy Cadillac, and not really working for herself, but living off of the government. How long can we wait for a living wage? Is it government that's going to come to our aid, or do we need to break the chains ourselves? Saw some of the irresponsible growth of debt and deficit financing. Something like this could be on the test. You know, why are there benefits to competition? The idea that since Reaganomics, we've seen a rise in the gap between the rich and the poor. And this, lesson 9, kind of just bleeds into lesson 10. Lesson 10 is like the consequences now of economic, neo-economic classic liberalism, neoclassical economic liberalism, sorry. And that's with the deregulation. We have the financial meltdown we talked about last week, the Great Recession. So we should expect to see a Great Recession on the test. Here you have a boom-bust cycle, and we could use this in saying, you know, according to Keynes, you know, which quarter does the government most desperately need to respond to the challenges within the economy? So we'd ask you to be able to read a graph for that one. The financial meltdown also allows us to look at, you know, what caused it. And the cause of the financial meltdown was we had something in place, the Glass-Steagall Act, but because of deregulation, the Glass-Steagall Act was no longer in effect, and therefore there wasn't anything to protect consumers from the greed of bankers. So because of Reaganomics, this problem was recreated. And then as a response to the financial meltdown, we have the Dodd-Frank Act. So these are in red. So you might want to know what the Dodd-Frank Act and the Glass-Steagall Act were and how they connect into the regulation, deregulation problems here. We have the idea of the government coming to the aid of Wall Street but not Main Street, and the hypocrisy of them asking for bailouts. So these are all nice little cartoons. Not going to put them all on the test, but you could see one of them. The term austerity, you know, oh no, we've spent too much, we need to cut spending on you, but not on corporations, leading to banks versus people. Then one of the final things here is the spread of issues to Canada, and we see how it is dealt with in Canada. With the Harper investment in the Canada Action Plan. And for all intents and purposes, that's this unit.